fine? Yeah. All good? In the back as well? Good? Great.
Hi everybody, thank you for coming. My name is Ruby, and I'm very pleased to introduce Dragan, who is a philosopher and psychoanalytic theorist based in London, and he is the president of Institute 17, which is a new leftist organization. Today he's going to speak on Badiou, Deleuze, Lacan, on truth.
On truth, yeah. Thank you, everyone. When I began preparing for this lecture several weeks prior, I had a relatively modest aim. It was to elucidate to the best of my abilities what I had chosen, namely democratic materialism, the subject, dialectic, and affinity, the title that probably also inspired me to attend this talk. As it turns out, as it often is in this discipline, in this field of infinite possibility, one might say we find ourselves confronted with an irreducible difference of truths. The most decisive witness to this content that I will speak about today is not within the notions advanced, but also in the process that I myself have been through. It would perhaps have been wiser to resist the impulse to reverse the entire orientation of today. I am unfortunately not very wise. The position I will advance in this lecture is at once radical and, as I see it, somewhat unavoidable. But before I properly begin, I would like to thank my dear colleagues and friends at Institute 17. At once colleagues, because without them, this project would not have come to light, and at other times friends for disagreeing with me more often than not. I would like to begin with an apology. After all, it's in the guise of the apology that we're allowed to return to the most archaic form of philosophy itself. The ancient Greeks were intelligent enough to define the apology proper as a speech in defense. If for a moment we adhere to the strictest etymological root of the term, we find that the prefix "apo" designates a breaking away from the logos, from reason, from thought itself. That is, in the apology proper, we're able to determine a particular excess that is never subsumed under reason, a sort of dematerialization. There is a peculiar aberrance at play here. Although the original meaning had, by the 16th or 17th century, transmorphed itself into this colloquialism that we now use, we find with psychoanalysis its most imminent return. So what is an apology? Well, in some sense, the Greeks were only half right. An apology operates through a logic of deferral. The central lesson of psychoanalysis is that the apology is a form of submission to some sort of superior logic. It's quite striking to consider how the act of forgiveness is also the same as asking for it. This dialectical opposition falls under distinctive unity. Neither parties really mean it, but now the matter has been deferred to the function of an other that will resolve the conflict for both of them. After all, I've said sorry, you've forgiven me. In reality, neither of us really mean it. We've just displaced our responsibilities to a non-totalizable directive. This is not to say that the apology, qua request for forgiveness, is an inherently ingenuine act. Neither is the pardon. Both admit an honest moment of subordination to an order which the subject is all too hesitant to recognize. So to return now to my own apology, first I would like to apologize for the length of the subsequent talk. It's a lot longer than I had wished it to be, but as it turns out, broaching a topic as difficult as the infinite requires certain lengthy preludes. This leads me to my second apology. Though the title of this talk is Democratic Materialism, as it was, that was the locus of my departure. However, that has changed, as you will see. My third request is that you forgive me for the multiplicity of thinkers I will draw upon, and ironically, despite being an investigation of Badiou's theories, for the special privilege that I will give to Deleuze and Lacan that you will find here. I'm prepared to defend a certain provocative position, that certain fundamental concepts shared between this triad of thinkers are not as irreconcilable as we may believe. In fact, certain answers can be found in their differences. We'll be guided by a series of tenets of Badiou's and Deleuze's thinking that open up questions that are equally difficult and promising. The overarching questions that led me to the revelations are akin to what animated Alain Badiou in the series of lectures he gave at the Collège International de Philosophie between 2001 and 2004. Namely, what does it mean for philosophy to be present to its own time? Does this unique arrangement of a temporality that is undifferentiated to itself open up the possibility for more fundamental questions regarding truth? What, if anything, is truth? Is the truth tied in any way to the infinite? Where does the subject stand in all of this? Are the possibilities of establishing a relationship between the subject and the infinite merely caught up in ideological superstructures that perpetually return all symbolic meaning back to itself? Is there a space, limited as it is in today's growing world of a hyperreal, for truth itself? And how does the subject defend itself from the onslaught of this reiterative generative system? What are the images that give the underlying structure of subjective experience their ideological coherence? In short, a better title for this presentation would have been Truth, Temporality, and Infinity between Badiou, Lacan, and Deleuze, all together read by Lacan. However, for fear of being either too unwise or being too careful, which at times is the same thing, that is what the majority of our talk will be dedicated to. So today I'll be aiming to do a few things. One is to investigate the nature of Badiou and Deleuze's ontologies and events. Two would be looking at the conception of truth and its relationship to the infinite. I will propose a new theory of subjectivity that's a result of the difference between a difference of truths and the truths of difference, two concepts which all derive from Badiou and Deleuze respectively, and then to demonstrate the Lacanian reconception of the subject as an irreducible gap between the two. I don't expect to answer all the questions today, but I do expect to address them. Before I begin, I will offer some words of encouragement. Many of our difficulties are self-imposed, that is to say, as Lacan puts it in Seminar 1, when one tries to elaborate upon some experience, it isn't so much what one understands as what one doesn't understand. That one of the things we must guard against is to understand too much. So I invite you to try to understand just not enough to grasp my following lecture in its entirety. I will begin with Badiou's ontology. When investigating this or that topic, philosophy as well as psychoanalysis confronts its reader with, at best, an internally regressive array of arguments that leave them confused and, at worst, exasperated. And such is the case with Badiou's ontology for many that have tried to read it. This is our starting position. An ontology is a study of being qua being. What does it mean for there to be beings? In line with the tradition, the necessary prerequisites for discussing this matter originates in one of the Platonic dialogues, namely the Parmenides. The dialogue confronts us with a seemingly difficult yet almost too simplistic question. How can things be both many and one at the same time? Like to use a concrete example, we may turn to the material world. The objects that we are presented with, the chair, the table, even more complex systems like the forum gathered here today, is composed of a multiplicity of parts. The moment we examine these elements more closely, one chair, one table, one person, we discover that it's also a collection of parts, relations, and determinations. This was a topic of great anxiety for the pre-Socratics. Plato's Parmenides leaves us with two hypotheses. Either the one is, or the many, what in the Parmenides is called the others, are. Either there exists some fundamental unity or substance, we can think of Spinoza's Deus sive natura here, or we're left with an inherent multiplicity. Let us see how Plato operates with the one. In Parmenides, Plato argues that one cannot pronounce the one is not without giving this oneness some minimal participation in being, which in the Greek reserves its own terminology, namely to be non-being. That is, to negate something, as in to say the one is not, reserves and affirms its existence in the first place. To think of there being no one means that we preserve an aspect of its existence in the negation itself. Badiou's reading of Plato is of crucial importance here. Badiou recognizes that there is nothing within his considerations that derives a general ontological theory. He says, if one can declare that something is not presented, then the latter certainly participates in the non-beingness of not being non-being. That is, despite the negation, it's not the one that must fundamentally be, but that the name of the one participates in being itself. The other hypothesis remains that the one is not. There is no fundamental substance, no Spinozan monism, let's say. Well, that is, in the metaphysical world, it's nothing but a multiplicity of multiplicities. Many of manys, inconsistent multiplicities that are structured the same way organs, cells, tissues are organized and subsumed under a specific person, under the appearance of a person. This is a hypothesis that is certainly entertained in the Parmenides and taken to the limit of its possibilities before Plato completely abrogates plurality with a simple phrase, if the one is not, nothing is. So Plato, in his most fundamental determination, believed in a unity of sorts. But the question is left open in the Parmenides. If we take the phrase, if the one is not, nothing is, Badiou asks us to consider, what is this nothing? Well, if we turn to the French, we may find ourselves closer to an answer than the English variant. When we say nothing is, we are met with the expletive ne, rien n'est. However, when looking at the Greek and the French, we're illuminated by the fact that it is not that nothing is, but it's rather the nothing is. This very nothingness is still a something. When everything is stripped to its final parts, what we are left with is this thing called, in Badiou's terminology, the void. But the void is not the same thing as the one, because to ascribe this nothingness some fundamental privilege is to reinscribe it in the order of oneness. The void remains the proper name of being. It's the best way to understand it. Thus, for Badiou, ontology as such, it consists of what you would call consistent multiplicities that are structured under this operator called the count as one. It's the thing that gives a certain structure unity. For example, when looking at a specific person, despite them being a multiplicity of parts, they are counted as one. It's a structuration. In short, Badiou argues that ontology is not merely just a philosophical enterprise, but a mathematical science. Without complicating the matter too much, which I'm afraid I might have already done, for Badiou, a pure science of the multiple is set theory in mathematics, as it provides the properties for sets in general without specifying the actual properties of the set's members. Ontology is a representation of presentation, drawing on Heidegger's distinction between being, capital B, and beings, between the act of being and the things themselves. Badiou replaces the term beings with situations, structured multiplicities, such as object, communities, artwork, systems, and so on. Badiou's central ontological axiom is that the one is not. There is no ultimate unity, substance, God, or totality underlying reality. Instead, reality consists of multiplicities. What appears as a unified thing in front of me is only the result of a structuring operation that Badiou calls, as I mentioned, the count as one. So even if there is no primordial equivalence between unity and being, Badiou recognizes, in light of the Lacanian dictum, il y a de l'un, there is some oneness, there exists some unifying effect in the presentation of being. Unity, therefore, is not this pre-originating matter, but this unifying effect in the presentation of being. It's an effect of organization, not a fundamental feature of being itself. From this perspective of the structure situation, this underlying multiplicity appears as nothing. This nothing, as I mentioned, is what Badiou calls the void, the proper name of being. So I will note at this point that we have surmounted the hill of the most difficult part of the lecture. I didn't think it would be appropriate to talk about the event without addressing ontology first. So I might pause now if there's any questions on Badiou's ontology in and of itself, if there's anything you'd like to clarify. If there's any questions whatsoever, if not, we can continue. Okay, everyone understands Badiou. So we turn now to Badiou's event and its success, and also if you have a question in the meantime, you can always interrupt me. Totally fine. Yeah.
So how does set theory interact with unity? Right? Would a unity of multiplicities be a set or a category of sets?
So one of the special properties of sets is that it's able to present something, i.e. elements, without necessarily giving its elements any sort of condition or essence, let's say. So for Badiou, set theory is the most basic way in which to present a multiplicity. You can present it as a multiplicity of parts without describing what the essence of the actual element is. This is the Kantorian revolution, the post-Kantorian revolution, right? You have different ways of combining axioms and saying things about the elements without saying what the elements actually are. That allows you to manipulate elements, to put them under the categories of oneness, for example, without saying that what lies under the element itself is God, substance, and monism, a single, I don't know, single particle of the universe as you have it. Does that make sense? Yeah, that's a great question, because the set theory part is complicated. If you're curious, there's a book by Badiou called Infinite Thought, which explains it really, really well. But no, for Badiou, mathematics is ontology. That's one of his primary axioms that he will take on. Right. So what then is the event for Badiou? Well, in the realm of being, we have from time to time, in an entirely contingent manner, the occurrence of an event that takes place, belonging to an entirely different dimension from the dimension of being, that is of non-being. We may take into consideration the following example. So, French society in the 1960s consisted of various knowledgeable orders of being, organized into different presented multiplicities, the economic, political, sociological arrangements, the ideological conflicts, the people themselves, and so on. These are, to an extent, wholly determinable to knowledge, but there is no amount of knowledge that will enable us to predict or account for an event, namely the revolutions, the student movement of 1968. It's in this precise sense that the event emerges out of nothing. According to Badiou, there will be a fully deployed situation, which, as we have seen, is a presented multiplicity, stabilized and lone coherence based on a founding element that does not belong to this plurality. Badiou understands that an event can only occur when something is removed from this equilibrium of this fully deployed state. What emerges here is an excess of subsets according to the generation of ordinates. So I'm referring back to mathematics, but I will refer some math terms and I'll explain them afterwards. In a finite set with an n amount of elements, there are always subsets which have an infinite number of elements. So that is to say that no multiple in a position can make one of everything that is included. Inclusion is irremediable excess over belonging. So from Badiou's point of view, the state of the situation is what he calls the metastructure of a situation. It controls this excess and designates the subsets of the set. So, put simply, this is something from a mathematician in the 1960s called Paul Cohen. He developed something called forcing. And forcing is a way of introducing entirely new rules in generated out of sets that were previously unthinkable. So a creation of something out of nothing is the best way to think about it. So the event, therefore, is never totally totalizable. We're always left with a surplus that can never be grasped by just pure conceptual thought. This is the same reversal that elucidates the misinterpreted Freudian death drive, the Todesliebe. The death drive has nothing to do with some return to some previous state of inorganic existence or of pre-existence. Rather, it's an excess of life itself. And there's a great example in Baudrillard's essay on cloning. He presents this idea that the duplication of a copy pushes subjects, which are inherently sexed, to a form of reproduction prior to sexuation. So I'm wondering, is this not the same desire towards annihilation different from the desire for a life in excess of itself? So humans are inherently of life. We are sex beings, we depend on other for reproduction. Well, this desire for cloning is this desire for an immortality, of a life in excess of itself. The forced situation of us produces a systemic barring from an apprehensible totality. There is no accessible infinite within the subject themselves as the carrier of the eternal, of the moral form of reproduction. So is the clone not this perverse manifestation of the very prohibition of accessing the entire totality of truth? the double of mystical desire, an attempt to abolish the non-coincidence upon which the genuine relation to the infinite depends, if it is possible, that's what we're going to talk about later. We see something akin to this logic in Kierkegaard's concluding and scientific postscript, which unfolds as a sustained demonstration of the impossibility of securing, through objective thought, the relationship between singularity and infinite truth. The question of how the subject exists in relation to the infinite is not left unanswered. Rather, in the manner of the drive, and here we have some Lacanian undertones already present in Kierkegaard, the question is constitutively deferred, displaced by the movement of existence itself. For Kierkegaard, this deferral is not a contingent limitation of the philosophical inquiry, which awaits its eventual resolution through a more adequate science, like would be in Hegel, for example. It names the irreducible structure of existence coexistence. It's the existence of something that completely resists completion. So what we have is an irreducible remainder. It's neither a positive effect of knowledge nor an imaginary projection, but a limit phenomenon whose resistance is totalization. And this much is something that Badiou recognizes in his logic of events. When one is completely absorbed by the event, for example, let's go back to Student Revolution of 68, when one is under the conviction that a new world is truly possible, that the infinite possibility of this new world is what he calls here, there is what he calls a disparition. And we can see this logic reveal itself in the 68 revolutions. Badiou, in giving a talk at the European Graduate School, fondly remembers his participation, saying it was not only my experience, something like an absorption of life and attention of the event, in the form where we cannot distinguish clearly between past, present, and future. Something different, something like a new time. So what's remarkable about Badiou's statement is not its positive content, but what it fails to totalize. He says we cannot distinguish clearly, something different. He says something like. There exists a form of emptiness, a circulation around this void of indiscernibility that is never fully captured by language. And this is most notable even in the slogans of the 68 revolutions. The slogan was, be realistic, demand the impossible. This was scribbled all over the walls of the Sorbonne. Soyez réaliste, demandez l'impossible. But what is precisely this impossibility? One of the central doctrines of Badiou is that the very notion of this impossibility, the subject never fully apprehends the event in its entirety. The event is not just this representable object, and within a given situation, it never contains some complete positive content. So I like to say that all eventual nomination is partial. This partial nominalization is what the critical concept of Badiou's philosophy, who borrows, as I mentioned, this term from Cohen mathematics, and if you want me to go more in detail about the math later, I'm more than happy to do so. So returning to the logic of the 68 revolutions, the celebrated injunction, this order to demand the impossible, expresses a double movement. First, it marks the emergence of an excess that completely escapes any classificatory logic to the existence of the order, resisting incorporation. There's an existence of a non-totalizable surplus, which resists any categorizations of a language to the models of formal organization, the university, the social arrangements, the political determinations, and so on. In addition to this, the impossible that they seek is not simply forbidden by the prevailing order, it is foreclosed by it. There's a strict negative determination of this impossible. The institutional arrangements do not allow for any horizon of conceivability of what this impossible could take the form of. The demand for this impossible, therefore, assumes a reflexive structure. What is demanded is precisely the impossible. The impossible returns by answering its own demand. What is petitioned is precisely its impossible itself. The revolutionary position is not that we do not know what we want in the revolution, but rather we want what we refuse to know for certain. Desire is directed towards a truth whose content cannot be anticipated from within the coordinates of the existing situation. So this is the name of the eventual dimension of politics itself. What is impossible from the standpoint of the situation becomes possible only through the intervention that transforms the coordinates. So the demand for the impossible is ultimately a demand that the situation cease to coincide with its own measure. Second, the radical indeterminacy of this impossible permits the revolutionary subject to infinitely renew its own position as the revolutionary. since the demand is directed towards that which the existing order cannot represent, it can never be exhausted by any determinate program or achieved state of affairs. By positioning themselves against the language of foreclosed totality, the revolutionary subject bars itself from any final reconciliations. There is, strictly speaking, no positive object of the demand beyond the demand itself. So this is how the impossible functions in the event. If there's any questions on that before we continue, more than happy to take them. Yeah.
So this is like a fundamentally, like in the wrong politics, like a anti-programmatic sort of mindset. Like, is it like fundamentally like an anti-programmatic sort of mindset? So like it's not like based off like I don't know the strict sort of stagism and like Marxist-Leninism. Is it like fundamentally like opposed to that? Like these guys just like I don't know. Like you get my point.
Yeah, I think I do. I think the point of Badiou's like partial event nominalization is not to explain like the historicity of certain movements, but to explain this continued reinvestment of desire in the situation itself. It's not that we speak of events and we know their inherent impossibility of capturing it in its totality. This nominalizations that you put on it are always either imaginary or partial. I think Badiou's point is that there exists this sustaining of desire itself in the event that is a requirement on the subject. And Deleuze has this great quote. He says, you have to earn or you have to be worthy of the event. In some sense, that is a similar request, which is what is put on the subject in Badiou. You have to earn the responsibility of the event through this continued reaffirmation of your fidelity towards it. So it requires a sense of loyalty. The only thing that's truly accessible is this renewed sense of responsibility for the event itself. Does that make more sense? Yeah.
Is it an ethical responsibility?
Badiou would say yes. There is an ethical responsibility. There's a calling towards it. He wrote this book on ethics, which, ethics is a very complicated subject, especially because now the majority of ethical discussions in universities or in public spheres center on this alterity of the other. How do you treat the other? Badiou recognizes that there's differences in everything. As you said, it's a multiplicity of multiplicity. What remains the same and what should be the object of ethics is, for Badiou, sameness. So if everything's regards to differences, he has this great quote. He's like, we only accept differences insofar as they're the same to us. That's the general scope of politics. Everything is subsumed under economic order. Integration only benefits us if it has economic benefits, and so on. For Badiou, fidelity towards the event is an ethical dimension. It would require the sustained demonstration that you are faithful to the event. Deleuze will not precisely think of it in the same way. But Badiou is very, very static in the determination of how ethical situation is. So, in short, Badiou's philosophy seeks to expose and determine the potential of radical innovations in every situation. So, in Logique des Mondes, Badiou distinguishes three modes of this human subject. So it's going to tie back to the question on the ethical responsibility. You have the faithful, as we mentioned, the reactionary, and the obscurantist. The faithful subject is defined by fidelity to an event and its commitment to the exploration of possible truths opened up by the event. The reactive subject, or the reactionary on the other hand, refuses to incorporate itself into that event. And this subject sees the possibility of a new present, but fights against it and instead calls for the restoration of an improved version of the past, hence reactionary. Finally, the obscurantist neither produces a new event nor calls for return to the past, but occludes the past and allows the present to descend into what Badiou calls the night of the non-exposition. So I aim to relate these to the subject of Camus' La Peste, if you've read the play by Camus. If you haven't, it's a very popular book. The plot centers around the fictional French Algerian city of Oran as it combats a plague outbreak and is put under a citywide quarantine. So the drama of the novel begins when the protagonist, Dr. Rio, finds a dead rat at the doorstep of his consulting room. Now, managing a clinic, a rat would be entirely inadmissible. After all, the clinic is supposed to be sanitary, clean, free from fleas, and so on. Naturally, the concierge of this building is not very happy with the finding of a rat. So here we find our first subject, namely the obscurantist. Immediately confronted with the radical novelty of this new event, as the protagonist tells us, nothing new ever happened in the city of Oran, this seemingly hyper-vigilant concierge, Monsieur Michel, this immediately displaces the cause of the event to be some form of trickery from a child or another. What is striking here is how tightly Badiou's obscurantist resembles Lacan's logic of the other of the other. Lacan's basic formulation is that there is no other of the other. In its most elementary sense, this other, the locus of law and symbolic guarantee, has itself no guarantee. But this is not that there is no other of the other, it's rather that the other of the other is never really there. The traumatic moment is not thus simply a discovery that the reality is false, but the encounter with the fact that there is no ultimate guarantor of meaning. Yet this absence is often intolerable. Rather than accepting the inconsistency of the symbolic field, the subject constructs a fantasy of some hidden agency operating behind appearances. Another of the other, who secretly knows, controls, orchestrates events. Here you'll see in popular culture the recurring memes with the Rothschilds somehow ensuring that I make it late to my lectures every single day. Badiou's obscurantist exhibits a homologous structure. Confronted with the radical novelty of the event, the obscurantist refuses to encounter it as such. Then we have the reactionary, exemplified by the board of directors, the board of doctors, who, even when confronted with mounting evidence that a plague is emerging, resist recognizing it as such. They say no. The response is not simply one of ignorance, but of reinterpretation. The situation has to be understood according to the already established categories and familiar explanations. Rather than encountering this plague as an unprecedented event, they demand a transformation of no one's understanding. They are perpetually vexed by the new information and statistics that rise, and they're like, oh, can't believe this many rats came out of the sewers last night, or that Monsieur Michel died. By the way, the obscurantist died first, so take a note. They are perpetually vexed by new information, all the while rejecting the inherent directive of a new event. And then you have the protagonist, Dr. Badiou. It can be read, to an extent, I'm simplifying here, the figure of the faithful subject, insofar as he remains committed to the consequences of the event once it's recognized. This fidelity, going back to your point on ethics, is what appears in this insistence to recognize the situation for what it is. The officials, they hesitate to use the term plague, concerned with uncertainty and the social disorder that might rise from it. But Rieux's determinations are to refuse to subsume the plague under any transcendent field of organization, something from the outside is doing this to us, nor to reject it. It's not a divine punishment or metaphysical necessity. He consistently, and this is the most striking part about the novel, is he insists on confronting this brutal and imminent reality. I've explained the three subjects, but I pray for my audience as much as it did for me. Badiou's conception of the event provokes a lot of possibility and a lot of hesitation. One theme runs throughout Badiou's philosophy, a summary of the entire gesture, like I mentioned, fidelity. It's a dual rejection of the predominant thought of our time. First, it's an erudite refusal to settle into position within what is determined as the end of philosophy, the end of history, maybe even the end of psychoanalysis. As Rancière explains, it's a refusal of the maneuver by which philosophy, proclaiming its own end and its double, the calamity of our time, its darkened face named metaphysics, still proves its own loyalty, as it indefinitely re-exploits its own history in the figure of a heroic inheritance. Second, it's a refusal to follow the dominant weight of statized thought. And here's the double play on the words statized, as in static and controlled by the state. As Rancière elucidates, the question of loyalty today, of fidelity, this ethical question, gets lost either through an excess or through a lack. There are two dominant forms in which contemporary thinking handles history, politics, analysis, theory, philosophy. Either there is inordinacy, a return to these antediluvian beliefs as pure dogma, or deficiency, where any claim to an event is treated as a tribunal of demystification. Badiou's philosophy represents a resolute attempt to construct a conceptual space of loyalty. What we have is a profound echo of Lacan's ethical imperative, not to give way to one's desire. So the only thing which one can be guilty of in Lacan's eyes is that given ground relative to one's desire. Fidelity, a commitment, is a certain subjective decision. That is what is at stake in Badiou as an ethical conduit of our time. Nevertheless, as I announced in my introduction, the discussion of Badiou's event will also open up new spheres of interrogation. There are certain inevitable issues that arise in Badiou's event. One, first for Badiou, the event does not simply present itself as an imminent rupture of the situation. It's only legible insofar as the subject retroactively describes it through nomination, sustains it through fidelity. This preserves what I call a certain stasis of the event. As Badiou determines it, it is essential that the event must not only be unpredictable in its conception, but dubious, consistent only in the retroaction of the interpretive intervention. The site of the event where it begins, in particular his meditation on Mallarmé in the book, in a manner as to make the interpretation of the event a response to a singular question. That is what it has taken Badiou. He subsumes it under one. Did the event, or did it not take place? That's the only question. Thus, the event has no temporality other than loyalty to the intervention, positing that there was, in fact, an event. Second, fidelity runs the risk of turning the event into a fixed locus of reference. This is not the same as my previous point. A fidelity may result in anchoring of meaning, instead of generating newness, becoming a normative reference point. This produces a conceptual rigidity in which the event becomes a fixed center, an absorbative nucleus rather than an ongoing disruption. Hart and Negri push this idea even further, claiming that this retrospective approach to the event, in fact, does not give us the rationality of an insurrectional activity. Third, the event itself receives an ontological status that results in this distancing of two strata, of the separation of an eventful time and a historical time. The separation results in certain protective dormancy, as I like to call it, that secures the event on a entirely different plane of existence. So this very retroactive constitution, both through the partial normalization of the event and through its fixation into an order that is outside historical time, as Badiou will call it, turns this dynamism into a structure. So these 3 points which I presented carry the inherent risk of negating the very thing that Rancière, among others, have praised the project of fidelity of, a defense against historical fatalism or demystifying relativism. But this securing of the subject of the event through normalization, a preservation of the event as such, results in a subversion of its own disruptive openness. So in short, Badiou's event has a particularly perplexing ontological status. It appears, its name, and then becomes an anchor for that the subject maintains fidelity towards. Despite Badiou's insistence on the event's evanescence, its appearance and its disappearance, its partial normalization of this event functions as a stable reference. 1968 becomes a name that fidelity in some sense orbits. What unifies these difficulties is not merely cumulative but structural. Each names a different face of a similar operation. Whilst Badiou's stated ambition is to liberate the subject from the closed determinations of the situation, from the state, from established knowledge, and so on, the very mechanism by which this liberation is achieved reinstalls a certain rigidity that I argue for. So, to continue from Badiou's event is the question of how do we remediate this? How do we preserve the idea of a disruptive event, of the possibility of something truly changing the order of things, whilst at the same time trying to loosen the rigidity of this anchoring, of this retrospective determination? So, I would like to propose a radically alternative reading of Badiou, a Badiou read by Deleuze, read by Lacan, that will allow us to reconceptualize what it means to be a subject of the event, perhaps what it means to be a subject at all. So we've covered this ontology of being, and I'm happy that you guys are bearing with me until now. We've covered the events. So we've seen a critical determination of one type of subjectivity, one formulated by Badiou. So what is at stake here, and notice in going back to the quote by Badiou, he says that the 68 revolutions were the creation of a different time. So it seems as though in this subjective dialectic between the event and the subject, there's also something really important with regards to time, temporality. For Badiou, there is three determinations of this relationship between the subject and time. The first for Badiou is the mystic. The mystic position is a position of privilege in which the relationship between the subject and the infinite occurs at one point. So, for example, in meditative prayer, it is the unification of the subject and the infinite God that come into one point. This for Badiou is the mystic position. A misreading of Deleuze, in my opinion, but that's into discussion. The mystic position is similar to what Meister Eckhart calls the eternal now. He's saying the present of this moment is this perpetual reinstantiation of what it means to have a relationship between a singular subject and the infinite God. Again, this is not Badiou's, this is what Badiou thinks of these three different positions. The second for Badiou is the Hegelian, or rather Bergsonian position, in which time itself, the movement of time, is this progression of the infinite. So in the first case, you have a unification between the present moment and the infinite as God. And the second one, time itself is the infinite. Again, I'm not sure how much I agree with Badiou's readings of Hegel in this specific regard. That's a topic for another discussion, which I'm going to be publishing in a few weeks. The last position for Badiou is his own philosophy, in which the relationship between the subject and the infinite, because that's what at stake, that is what is at stake here, is a possibility of creation. The subject can create new infinities, and new infinities are inherently linked with new times. But when we create a new infinity, we create what Badiou calls an outside time in time. So why turn to time at all in this long, elaborate discussion? I've confused you enough with mathematics, I've thrown in the event, I've messed everything up, now we're talking about time. Well, the difficulty I've identified in Badiou is at its root a temporal one. Fidelity does not merely require a stable object to be faithful to. It requires a stable past, a point that has already happened, that can be named, dated, and held in place. 68 revolutions, scribbled on the whiteboard, on the Sorbonne. And this functions as the measure against whether we're loyal to the event or whether we will betray the event. What is needed then is not to think of another theory of difference, but another theory of how time relates to the event. One in which there is no fixed position left for an event to occupy in the first place. And this is why we turn to Deleuze. Deleuze says in his book on Hume, his first ever book, the subject, at root, is the synthesis of time. For those who study Lacanian psychoanalysis, you will understand how important time is for Lacan. Not in the chronological sense, but in the logical sense. If you come to my seminars and weekly readings, we've gone over this in significant elaboration. If the subject at root is the synthesis of time, then we can't approach the question of subjectivity by first fixing what a subject is and only afterward asking how it persists or changes. We have to reverse the order of the inquiry itself. So this is the wager we now take up from Deleuze, which is difficult, which is a radical position that I will have to defend. I'm sure my colleagues in C17 will harass me for this for the rest of my life, but this is the risk that we take up. So how does Deleuze think of time? That's the first question. Well, the ancient view was that time was the measure of movement. This is what we have in the original debates between the pre-Socratics, which would result in all these famous paradoxes of Zeno, like the Achilles and the tortoise, which maybe you guys are familiar with. It views time as subjected to movement. Bergson, which is one of the phenomenologists, if you can call him that, believed that Zeno, this is the traditional locus of where the problem of time and motion began, through a reduction of motion to traverse space, failed to understand the nature of time and movement. According to Bergson, time is the metaphysical sphere conceived as a homogeneous medium analogous to space. So this spatialization of time is something inherently belonging to the order of the ancients. You can read a lot of Psychoanalytic books on what they thought time was. For Deleuze, he believes that Kant was the first one who reversed and freed time. This is this background against which Kant made his movement. Deleuze treats it as a genuine revolution. Up until this point, the basic relationship was time measures movement. Kant flips this and reverses this, says movement now takes place within time. It seems somewhat obvious now, but when it was written, it was not so. Time is no longer derived from the dependent on things on which it measures. It becomes, in Kant's phrase, a pure and empty form. So here's the part that Deleuze pushes even further than Kant himself. If time is no longer anchored to anything stable, that includes the self that lives inside it, Kant notices that time on its own account can't actually be perceived directly. And it doesn't just constitute things, it also wears them away and does them even as it makes them. So the only thing holding it here, experience together all is an active mental synthesis. So Deleuze's critique of the traditional notion of time can be summarized by the following. Time has been understood by what happens in it, thus is something secondary to what moves or changes. Consequently, time was reconstructed either with a privileged position or substituted by the traversed space, as we have in Zeno. So instead, Deleuze presents a time conceived as in itself, rather than reconstructed in the traces of movements or events. This is what he calls pure time, and he believes it can free time from its subjection to movement. In what is philosophy, which is also to an extent the question of today's talk, what is philosophy and psychoanalysis, Deleuze and Guattari proposed the concept of a pure chaos to determine the pure form of temporality, which is also characterized as the idea of pure change, a differential, immanent idea. Chaos is not this absence of determinations, but rather the infinite speed by which they take place and vanish. This is not a movement from one determination to the other, but on the contrary, the impossibility of a connection between them. So, to explain time in Badiou's sense, you have to consider the differences between our perception of things and the question of difference in and of itself. Deleuze calls this pure difference in and of itself. So, what makes the present so special? What even is the present? What can we say about the present? Well, the present is the perpetual movement of the moment differing from itself. It's this infinite continuum. It's not that the present is somehow the collection of the past, future, and what we believe the present to be in a singularity, but the present itself is this perpetuating difference from itself. So going back to the central theme of my lecture, two questions which have animated, I think, up to this moment, and I promise I'll be done soon. What does it mean for philosophy to be present to its own time? And what is a truth? These guiding questions essentially point us to investigating the nature of a certain triadic unity. Truth, time, and the subject. Let us now turn to some central clarifications. I will propose 5 statements that I term the 5 axioms of truth to sound as much like Badiou as I can. I will present them and discuss their different derivations, and I promise we're nearing the end soon. 1 is we have to reject representational truth. By representational truth, I refer to the special relationship between thought and what is, as described by Aristotle. Aristotle says, to say of what is, that it is, and of what is not, that is not, is true. What Lacan, Badiou, and Deleuze share in their conception of truth is twofold. A, that truth is not some objective, transcendental reality. This is a dogmatic image of thought. The idea of a truth that retains stasis, that there exists both a coherence and a correspondence, are wrong-headed from the very premise. And B, the rejection that the truth is somehow independent of the subject. In fact, we can return to the Lacanian maxim, truth has the structure of fiction. So contrary to the usual readings of the statement, I would like to propose the idea that truth has the structure of a fiction, not because there exists something inherently illusory about the truth as such, but because there is a perpetual process of creation and reaffirmation. In a sense, it's the construction of a fiction. It's a creative process. The term fiction is derived from the Latin fingere, which means to form, mold, or shape. That is, the clay of truth is no less dependent on the potter's hands than the potter's hands are on the clay. The clay forms itself through the potter no less than the potter forms the clay, and in turn, the potter is formed by the clay as well. There is a mutual becoming. We cannot speak of truth without speaking of becoming. Two, that there exists a relationship between truth and the infinite. I haven't had time to go into all of the determinations of this, but merely because we have displaced truth from the position of a transcendental structure, as we've said, truth is not something outside that we have to search for, does not mean that we have exhausted the possibility of truth itself. To do so would be to collapse into relativism, which is the very thing that Badiou tries to defend against. If truth is to be more than just opinion, it must possess some relationship to the infinite. This is not the eternal of immutability, like God, for example, but the eternal is not opposed to contingency. It is the dimension of truth which persists through every contingent manifestation. Three, the relationship between the subject, the truth, and the eternal must be grounded in time, as I have mentioned. If eternity is conceived as that which stands outside of time altogether, then truth must once again becomes a transcendent structure, divorced from its conditions of emergence. Four is that this time functions as a mediation between the dialectic of truth and eternity, and can only be understood as the present. The present is the site in which truth is both enacted and exceeded. And five, if the truth is of contingent emergence and is located within time, then it must be tied to the event as well. So this isn't some, I'm not rereading everything and going back to Deleuze of some ununified flux, so to speak. There is a certain structuration that we have to obey. But these axioms have a really difficult task. It's to preserve the subject's relationship to truth as eternal, but at the same time, without fixing that eternity into some static convention. To allow truth, its becoming, without that becoming dissolving into relativism. So what is needed is a structure capable of holding both demands at once. The possibility of an infinite that is not transcendental, and trying to prevent some falling into the relativism of truth does not exist, everything is just mere opinion. So I've created quite a conundrum for myself, which I'm going to try to solve in the next 2 minutes of my lecture. I promise there's not more. The truth is the creation of an encounter with an event, or rather the subjective relationship to the event. This is what we know from Badiou. We cannot permit ourselves to reject this claim. Badiou's thesis of the evental space has to be preserved. The event accounts for creative immanence. Nevertheless, for Badiou, the true event, if we can call it that, is consequence of subjective fidelity, going back to the question of ethics, and as I talked about the three subjects in Camus' book, renders the possibility of a new form of the infinite. It's the creation of a new time in which that respective truth is prescribed. So, as I mentioned, this is what Badiou talked about, his third position of the relationship between time and the eternal, in his position of displacing the mystic, displacing the Hegelian Bergsonian, and allowing the Badiouian subject to come through as this creator of the eternal. It's able to create a new time in time. And this is the outside time of the subject as a subject of the exception. So the time of the event is not historical time for Badiou. It's the historical time of the state, of the linear, repetitive, mundane chronos of dominant ideology. One of my colleagues likes to say that Badiou just thinks that we're a bunch of pea zombies walking around until something happens, which forces us to take up a certain position against it. So it's this rejection of the dominant ideology of the status time. Eventual time is disrupted and it's inaugural. It's a construction of the infinite empirical duration of the idea. However, to what extent do we have to assume that there exists this like practice of that time outside time? We have seen, thanks to Deleuze, that it is the time, or the aeon as he likes to call it, that persists, the fundamental dimension of time that structures everything we experience. Badiou claims that there can be the creation of a new temporality in which the truth, previously indiscernible to the state of the situation, forms itself. The subject's fierce loyalty to the possibility of this new infinity fixes the truth as eternal. But what is precisely eternal about the truth? Have we really considered it to its fullest extent? Fundamentally, and this is a radical claim, I believe that Badiou's position fails to connect the essential feature between the eternal truth and the truth of eternity. Although I'm not accusing Badiou of referring to representational truths, the truth qua truth is not the truth through this transcendental, extra-subjective verification. The very determination of Badiou's truth as wholly other to the subject, contingent on perpetual affirmation. At the same time, we cannot claim that the truth is this ongoing difference, a pure flux, dissolving itself into mere change. This would be Deleuze's claim. A truth is a truth precisely because every instantiation of it fails to be totalized. To speak of an eternal truth is to recognize the process and not the truth itself as eternal. Here I propose a third structure that attempts to reconcile these two divergent theories. The truth is a series of differences whose internal tendency is precisely towards a non-difference, without ever attaining its differentiation. The identity of the truth is not given in advance, not achieved at one point, and most certainly not the derivation of some transcendental category, God, for example. It's the orientation of the failed utilization of differing itself. In this sense, the truth persists due to its own internal instability and its own internal inability of the relationship between truth and itself. Badiou wishes to preserve the singularity of truth, its capacity to interrupt, to rupture, to create new things. However, this requires a minimal transcendence that he gives it, wherein the truth exceeds the situation whilst being immanent to it. On the other hand, Deleuze preserves this continuity of difference, that all production is ongoing, there exists no privileged moment of rupture, precisely because every moment is already differential. Nevertheless, I believe it's possible to mediate these two divergences. A truth remains a truth precisely because its every instantiation is a failure of totalization. The event, therefore, is a unique moment that initiates the truth procedure, and this event is not a historicized unique moment in time, neither as a possibility of a time outside of time, but the event is itself immanent within the truth. I like to say that the truth contains every event of its genesis. Every instantiation of the proof of the infinite set of prime numbers, for example, that began with Euclid, contains within it every history of its instantiations, the networks of subjective forces that brought it to be, every amazement, every single confusion. The event, therefore, is not this static moment that we relate to, but rather perpetual reintervention, reaffirmation, re-existence, all directed toward this non-totalizable excess. The truth persists because it fails. Badiou's event has a strange ontological status. It appears, it's given normalization, and then it becomes a fixed point where the subject maintains fidelity to. Even though Badiou insists the event itself is evanescent, the named event functions only as a stable reference. So, going back to an example that Badiou himself gives, and I'm nearing the end of my talk now, consider the proof of the infinitude of the primes. Euclid did not prove that there are infinitely many primes as a single static fact. He proved that for any finite list of primes, a further prime can always be produced beyond it. A procedure, it's not a closed result. 2,000 years later, Euler reinstantiates the same truth from entirely different means, showing that the sum of the reciprocals of the primes diverges. In 55, Furstenberg instantiates yet again through a topological argument of the integer, sharing nothing of Euclid's method or Euler's. each of these is a genuine instantiation of the same truth, not as an approximation of some prior, more correct proof, nor as a deviation requiring correction. The truth that there exists infinitely many primes is not located within any single one of these proofs. It is a truth that fails its own totalization. So where lies the subject? Well, the subject is one that cannot be located on either side of this divide. It's not the Badiou militant who carries forward the truth no matter what, nor is it the Deleuzian, and I refer here to early Deleuze, the flow of differential becoming in its totality. The subject is precisely this gap, the structure of non-coincidence that allows for both possibilities, as the agentic creator of truth. The subject who takes up a fidelity to an event actively produces the emanation of the infinite. Will, determination, militancy. The subject intervenes. This is what I call the difference of truths that the subject is able to produce. At the same time, the subject is the subject of truths of difference, less an agent but an effect, as we have seen by the differential movement of time itself. For Badiou, the subject is faithful to the event. For me, the subject is what makes the event unfaithful to itself. And this infidelity, this perpetual self-differentiation of the event by itself, is not the failure of truth, but its very condition. This is one of the main problems that Badiou takes up with Deleuze's project. And if there's more questions on how he sort of attacks Deleuze, whether it was because he thought Deleuze was wrong, or because Deleuze stopped replying to his letters, that is up to debate. But this leads us finally to the center of everything we've talked about together. As we have seen, truth remains a truth precisely because something fails. A truth is a truth precisely because every instantiation fails to be totalized. At least that's how I see it. If you want to debate me, I'm more than happy to. To speak of an eternal truth is to recognize the process, and not the truth itself as eternal. Precisely as a locus of the repetition of this untotalizable truth, the subject lies split. A subject split between differences of truths and the truths of difference. As my good friend Raphael likes to call it, the truth can't handle itself. So this is what answers Badiou's deepest complaint against Deleuze, the one I set out earlier at full strength. That unstructured becoming threatens to dissolve truth into mere change, indistinguishable drift with nothing towards a mark but a rupture from a continuity. So this drive, this is where we turn to Lacan, answers this precisely not because it's unstructured. A drive is not flux. It is patterned, repetitive, organized around the same non-arrival every single time. This is what gives truth becoming in the event their identity without giving them a fixed object. Not the sameness of content, but the sameness of structure, the same shape of a non-closure occurring. Badiou is right that pure unstructured becoming will dissolve truth into indifference. He is wrong that the only alternative is a one holding becoming together from underneath. So return with this back to Camus. The Dr. Rieu's fidelity was never loyalty to having correctly named the plague. It is his refusal to let the plague's excess settle into any closed, masterable category, whether the priest's theological meaning making or the administrator's bureaucratic terminology games. He does not give way on the desire that plague's non-closure provokes in him. The board of directors and doctors gives way precisely where Rieu is not, substituting familiar disease categories with an encounter for what exceeds them. So, going back to the Lacanian dictum, it's to never give up on the desire. And in that sense, that is what the truth is. It's a perpetual reinstantiation of its failure to differentiate from itself. And that's why the truth is not a static process outside of time. Neither is the truth purely relativistic. It's not opinion. That's what we have to defend against in our trying times. So what does it mean for a philosophy to be present to itself? It's precisely that. It's to maintain the non-totalizable potential of truth to differentiate from itself. And that's the truth. Thank you. Are there any questions?
Before we do take questions,
Okay.
I forgot to say, it's being recorded, so if you don't want to be on the World Wide Web, maybe keep your questions to
I can just turn it off. What do you want?
Yeah, no, of course.
Keep it going?
I mean, if you don't wish to be in the video, then it's fine. Like, you can ask me the question afterwards. It's totally okay. But it's just going to be your voice. It's not going to be your face. So yeah, just keep it up. It's fine. Yeah, that's fine.
No, very nice talk. I thought it was very well presented. I have one thing I'm curious, it's very much not to do with your final propositions, but with how they're changed. If truth and temporality and the event and subjecthood for you is what's opened up in the space between Badiou and Deleuze. On some level, I wonder if they're influenced by the fact that there is, to put it in a very cheap way, a plurality of spaces between Badiou and Deleuze. For example, I mean, two examples to me would be, first of all, and we take 1968, the difference in repetition, there's three incompatible temporalities for Deleuze. There's the temporality of the eternal return, habitual temporality, repetition that furnishes a thing being repeated, and then the temporality of mimosine, as he calls it, a trace that furnishes the scene it reproduces. And the eternal return, the temporality of death. And then I wonder as well, if you take, for example, the event, Deleuze at one point was one of the thinkers of the event, specifically 1969. But I would argue that between 68 and 80, I mean, I know you went prior to that with the Hume text, but between 68 and 80, there's a kind of slow rejection of any logic of the event. From 68, the event is a certain self-obscuring eternal return. Then 69, the event becomes very much in the same way that Roger Penrose puts in Twister theory. The event is only the relationships. Twister theory.
Okay.
The event is only the relationships it establishes. It is the relationship in the same sense that, for logical sense, the event is a temporary conjunction between logical series. Then 72, Anti-Oedipus, the event is some Nietzschean noontide, some like indeterminately postponed half utterance. And then I would argue 1980, it's a self-re-territorializing line of flight.
Yeah, he loses his mind after he meets Guattari.
Pardon?
He loses his mind after he meets Guattari.
Well, I think he regains it by the last text of A Thousand Fathoms. But the point is that the point I'm making is that within text there's multiple versions of temporality. And between text there's a slow rejection of any logical event, which for Badiou, at least the inconsistent multiplicity, the ontological one, is relatively, he claims it's self-consistent. It's in excess of itself, but there's a consistent across this text. There is something of an infinity in excess of itself. So I'm wondering, how do the propositions change if the relationship between Badiou and Deleuze also endlessly changes with, for example, between the 50s and the 1980s?
So the privileged position of the Deleuzean text that I was giving is precisely difference in repetition and logic of sense. I think that the main issues that Badiou has against Deleuze in his later work is this reinstantiation of the one within temporality itself. So being is the thing that time does for Deleuze. And that's why I think earlier Deleuze is a better conception of temporality in the event. I think this beautiful determination of the present as a present that's perpetually differing from itself. And he says, he gives three syntheses of time, indifference and repetition, but the one that is the most striking is not like the variable present or the passive history, but it's the fact that the subject is this perpetual contraction of all three syntheses of time, which are very complicated detail in length, but I'm giving that Deleuze the stage when putting him against Badiou. And Badiou wrote this paper that was published in Parisia on the problems with Deleuze's event. And the main thing that Badiou takes up against Deleuze is this idea that time itself is this emanation of being. That's what it is, it's the unfolding of being, if you want to have, in like an Bergsonian sense, this unfolding of being. But I think Badiou's rejection of Deleuze is this idea that there can only be the one eminent to this unfolding. But I think if you go to the Deleuze of logic of sense, and you read about things like the dark precursor, for example, this ability for time to perpetually differ from itself without having some one reinscribed into it that does perpetuate itself. I think that's the Deleuze I'm being privileged to, not the one I would say that comes later with anti-Oedipus, as though as you said, he sort of regains himself in Thousand Plateaus, but very much early Deleuze, the Deleuze about Guattari, and the Deleuze that comes back in what is philosophy with Guattari as well. A really beautiful text in which he describes this idea of the concept. Philosophy is the production of concepts, and that has a closer representation to what I think time really means for Deleuze. I think his attempt to dissolve the idea of the subject is complicated. To this day, I'm not sure what becoming animal means. But this idea of a dissolution of a subject is something that I think Deleuze definitely deviated from his early period, 68. So, yeah, actually. Yeah.
It's not really a question so much as a game with your remarks on Deleuze. Are you familiar with Deleuze's concept of quasi-causality?
Quasi-causality?
Yeah.
No.
Okay, so basically, like, it's quite a marginal concept in logic sense, also on Psychoanalytic, but we conceive of causality as like this distinct transhistoric agency, right? So then converting into a historical event, we say like an event was to an extent overdetermined, it had to happen, right? At any particular historic moment, it's an eruption or something that was always kind of there, right? Well, Deleuze kind of turns that on its head and says, no, actually, causality is only ever something we can inscribe in the present, retroactively into the past, right? Like, from this kind of process that is by itself chaotic and unmemorable, it's actually only something that we can conceive in the present.
Yeah, exactly. That's what it relates to him, the deontologization of the event itself. Yeah, that's a great remark. Yeah, thank you. Any questions? Yes, time. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, because someone like Jean-Paul Bernard would say that in Poirot, for example, the conjuring of Poirot.
In what, sorry?
About when you use the term infinite.
Yeah.
Now, would you draw this distinction between, because what Jean-Paul Bernard says is that it's absolutely a different infinite that the work in Poirot's work. It is the philosopher's infinite, but Poirot uses.
Yeah.
The mathematician's infinite is very different.
Yeah.
I'm wondering about how Badiou sees that difference.
So, to my knowledge, Badiou always privileges the philosophical infinite to the mathematical one. I think when you are a philosopher and you are creating new concepts, you prescribe to a certain order that you think might be applicable to it. Badiou's father was a mathematician. He uses mathematics to explain his ontology. The problem with doing that is you become very espoused to the processes that you're trying to explain. However, there's always a deficiency in mathematics, according to Badiou, in which it can explain his philosophy fully. So he turns rather to this philosophical conception of the infinite as eternal, rather than the infinite qua infinite as mathematical, as different types of infinities, for example, infinities larger than other infinities, and so on. But he preserves these Zermelo-Franco axioms of being able to determine different infinities between each other in sets. So he preserves that axiom. He's very much a ZFC category theorist.
Yeah, so like with truth, like with Badiou's concept of truth, isn't it like a bad, like it's like a Hegelian term I'm thinking specifically, but isn't it like an abstract universal that's not like fully passed through its own particularities and contradictions? Like isn't that like a necessary part of truth that those Badiou just like not?
Yeah, for Badiou it's complicated because, for example, like the example that I gave about the creation of the infinite series of prime numbers, for example, that in and of itself resists a contradiction. It's a mathematical proof. The problem with Badiou is that the truths remain eternal so long as there's a subject that is loyal to those commitments, so to speak. So it's quite a contingent subject. That's the problem. I think the Hegelian version, it's complicated. Yeah, I can't quite say on that matter, but that's how Badiou sees the relationship with truth and the infinite. Yeah.
More clarification question.
Yeah.
What element of Badiou's truth procedure through the fidelity of the subject to the event, did you think was static? Is that like?
Yeah. So the interesting part about that is because I knew that there would be a complaint about the use of the term static. So the thing for Badiou is not that the relationship between the subject and the event is static, so to speak. It's a perpetual reaffirmation, right? It's a perpetual differential becoming of the subject that associates the event. Well, in explaining it to one of my friends, I was saying that the relationship seems to be like this, kind of, with Badiou, whereas if we reinscribe it, they move in parallel, is how I see it. So the problem with Badiou is that the event remains named and it's retroactively determinable through nominalizations and through resubstantiating the fidelity towards it. But I'm trying to think the event as something that changes along with the subject itself. I think that the process is static precisely because it remains something that is determinable later by the subject and not something that becomes as a subject changes as well. Yeah.
I have a second question.
Yeah.
Which is that I'm recalling that Badiou suggests that the acts of the subject's fidelity, any sort of inscriptions or incisions of truth into the course of the situation reveal that the sort of counters one's esoteric to this order to their legality. What, and I guess that sort of destabilizes the coherency of situations as such. What implication would this have for your notion of time here, if any?
So, just to understand your question, as we know, the eventual site is, best way I can describe it is hand gestures, gets nominalized, as you said. For Badiou, a new time is created through this fidelity, through this act. I think the problem is that we're thinking of a time outside historical time, but still in time. This splitting of time off from itself, like this plurality of times that can possibly be created. I think we have to have, and this is one of the biggest ironies with Deleuze is that he sees time as a straight line, in some sense. In different repetition, he actually calls it the straight line of measure. I don't think Badiou's conception of a time splitting off from itself might be an accurate representation of how it actually functions. I think we have to conceive of how truths evolve within time itself, and not times that deviate from themselves to create new truths. I think the reverse is more important, at least for me. Yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone. There's more questions.